Late last year, I was able to borrow a new, unused Logitech G29 for a month to make a video about whether I thought high-end gear makes you faster. While I had the wheel and pedals here, I thought I'd put them through their paces so I could also make a dedicated review of what is probably the most popular starter wheel for sim racers. Before we get going, as I mentioned in the intro, I was able to borrow a new and unopened G29 from a viewer before Christmas. Logitech weren't involved, and my comments here are based on the 3 to 4 weeks of use I put into the wheel and pedals before I gave them back. I mention all this for the sake of clarity, so you guys understand where I'm coming from. Of course, that doesn't stop me from being super biased because, well, we all are. Since the video is really meant for people that are looking at buying their first sim racing wheel, I've gone a bit more in depth than I normally would. And as such, I'll timestamp all of the major sections in the top comments so you can skip the bits that you don't want to watch. So to start out, the Logitech G29 and G920 wheels are basically identical, with the former being compatible with PC and PlayStation platforms and the latter being PC and Xbox. These wheels are one of, if not the most popular entry-level sim racing wheels, and there's good reason for that. First up, it's cheap. In fact, as far as sim racing equipment goes, it's about as cheap as it comes. While there are products that cost less, they're very much aimed at the toy market and their performance is more Mario Kart than Mario Andretti. And the G29 also has a great reputation. Logitech have been making computer peripherals since about 1820, when they invented the optical Bluetooth mouse that Charles Babbage used for his difference engine. Not bad considering that was nearly a century before the introduction of the AA battery. I'm stretching the truth here a little, but the reality is that Logitech have a great track record for reasonably priced computer peripherals that perform pretty well, and that includes their sim racing kit. The G25 and G27 that preceded the G29 have been sim racing staples for nearly as long as the term sim racing has existed, and their reputation for reliability is pretty much unmatched. Finally, the G29 is widely available. You can pick one up on the high street, assuming that you still have a high street, that is. If not, the Bezos family store has your back as always. If you're new to the channel, I should probably let you guys know what my frame of reference is. My first wheel was a Thrustmaster Formula T2, which my dad bought in the mid-90s to play Jeff Crammond's Grand Prix 2, if my memory serves correctly. It didn't have force feedback, but the wheel did self-center using the awesome power of bungee cords. I made do with this until 2006 when I picked up the Microsoft Xbox 360 wireless racing wheel, which had motor-driven force feedback, of sorts. It wasn't great. During the next few years, I had a couple of bad third-party wheels from the likes of Mad Catz and their ilk, before getting back into sim racing again properly around 5 or 6 years ago when I purchased a Thrustmaster T300. Since then, I've upgraded to an open sim wheel-based direct drive solution and spent many hours on dozens of different simulator setups with pretty much all of the popular wheels and pedal sets. So when I start out this review proper in a moment by saying that I think the Logitech offering is still the best entry-level wheel, at least you know that I've tried out a whole bunch of them before coming to that conclusion. You may disagree with it, but hey, that's life. The Logitech offering is still the best entry-level wheel. Here's the TLDR. It does everything you need. It does it all competently. It's well made for a mass market product, and importantly, you'll be able to drive just as quickly on this wheel as with anything else. The G29 and G920 both sport a 280mm wheel rim clad with real leather. For an entry-level product, this is a nice touch, and it's hard to fault the ergonomics. The plastic body of the unit is styled to look like the front end of a car, which is something. Built into the body are a pair of very effective desk clamps. These are pretty low profile, work well, and in my opinion are just much better all round than most of the other wheels on the market. If you're not mounting your wheel to a desk, then there's also recessed threaded inserts that allow you to bolt it to a sim rig or really just about anything you fancy drilling holes into. While we're still looking underneath, check out the built-in cable management. This may not seem like much if you have a permanent setup, but if you have to keep taking it on and off of your desk every time you want to get into an argument with some idiot on Reddit, then it's a lifesaver. Moreover, it has cable channels which help keep the wires from getting pinched when you clamp it down or mount it, which is a nice touch. It does come with a hardwired USB cable, which is something I have an irrational fear of, having tripped over far more than my fair share of cables. That being said, with the cable management and the strain relief, this shouldn't cause too many issues. Speaking of cables, you'll also see the connectors for the pedals and the optional H-pattern gear shifter hidden nicely out of the way underneath as well. Finally, the unit is pretty solid for a mass market peripheral. You couldn't use it as a weapon in a home invasion situation, but in normal day-to-day use, it's more than adequate. Moving on to the pedals, as far as materials goes, it's a mixture of nice solid plastic casing for the main unit with metal parts employed throughout the pedal assemblies. The steel pedal plates are particularly nicely done. You might think that those black protrusions are some sort of rubberized grip, but at least on my unit they were hard plastic, which offered no additional friction. But really that's no bad thing, pretty much all race car pedals and the sim pedals that replicate them are just bare metal. For the desk mount, there's a retractable carpet gripper for, well, gripping carpet. It works reasonably well, but don't expect miracles. As with the wheelbase, there's another moulded cord here, so be careful with those wires. And before we move on, a note about the pedals themselves. The pedal movement is encoded using potentiometers, rather than the more accurate and reliable Hall effect sensors that are found on some other manufacturers' pedals. And if you Google Logitech potentiometer, you'll find that these can start to cause problems after a few years of use. The good news is that they can either be cleaned or replaced very easily, with plug-and-play kits and no soldering needed. Just Google it. So let's talk about how well the wheelbase works. Starting with the clicky bits, the shifters feel okay. There's not a lot of resistance, and there's really not much in the way of positive engagement when you do select the next gear. Suffice to say that you're not going to feel like a driving god banging through the gears, but they're functional. And I didn't suffer any misshifts during my time with the wheel. Meanwhile, the other buttons are what I'd describe as third-party gamepad quality, which is to say they work, but you're just not going to be advancing your Mortal Kombat career with them. Of course, the buttons on the G29 are PlayStation specific, while the G920 features a more Xboxy vibe. And PC users can of course assign any of the buttons to do whatever they like, because Logitech's not your dad. Moving on to more rotational matters, the G29 set uses a Hall effect sensor to read the position of the wheel, which ensures good accuracy and reliability. So, unsurprisingly, I encountered nothing but excellent control precision when using the wheel. The force feedback mechanism is gear-driven as opposed to the belt drive or directly driven mechanisms of more expensive units, but more about that later. Being a gear-driven wheel, you can feel a small amount of granularity in the movement, or perhaps you could call it stepping or cogging, though I think that would be grossly overstating it. The wheel itself is free-moving, and other than that tiny amount of granularity introduced by the gear train, it's all good here. But there's a lot more to a sim racing wheel than just the input signal. And what the wheel outputs here is just as important. We're talking force feedback. I'm going to take a quick aside to explain why this is important for those that aren't familiar, so just skip this part if you think that this is as redundant as teaching your Uncle Dave how to ruin Christmas with one of his red-faced political rants. If you've not used a sim racing wheel before, it could be easy to overlook this as similar to the vibration you feel in a gamepad, but this is a very different beast. When you're driving a real car, either on the road or on the track, your body provides information about how the car is interfacing with the environment. You feel G-forces, vibrations, etc. that let your brain know how the car's behaving. When you're sat in a chair playing a video game, you have none of that, which can make driving games particularly difficult. However, if you have a force feedback wheel, racing sims provide highly useful information through the wheel about how the car's interfacing with the road surface when everything's going well, and with other objects when things are going less well. The resistance on the wheel increases with the loads on the simulated car, giving you essential force feedback about how the car is behaving. Without force feedback, feeling the grip limit is impossible, and you have to rely purely on visual cues, which simply put is just much more difficult. But with force feedback, you can feel the car go slightly over the limit, the wheel feels lighter, and you can instinctively correct the car with the appropriate control input, usually countersteer. Force feedback feel is tough to communicate, so hopefully this analogy should help clear things up a bit. The force feedback on the G29 is a bit like listening to music on your desktop PC speakers. It sounds okay and you can hear all of the words and instruments. More expensive feedback systems are akin to listening on a consumer hi-fi set of speakers. You can crank up the volume a bit more without it distorting, and you get a bit more vibe. Whereas direct drive wheels are for audiophiles that want to hear every last nuance as clearly as possible. The force feedback generated by the G29 is, without wanting to damn it with faint praise, pretty reasonable. The forces the wheel can generate are on the lower end of the spectrum, with a reported torque of between 2 and 2.5 Newton meters. For reference, I've seen Thrustmaster wheels quoted as between 3.5 and 4, while Fanatec's offerings run between 5 and 8. And some direct drive wheels can generate forces of up to 30 Newton meters if you want to test how well your arms are attached at the shoulders. The torque generated by the G29 is enough to feel what the car's doing. Bumps are pronounced, and so is the rotational position of the car, enabling you to apply countersteer when necessary. It's not going to make you feel like you've just done a double stint at Daytona at the end of a session, but it's enough to do the job. But strength is only one aspect of the force feedback mechanism, and I think the reaction speed of this setup has both good and bad points. The geared mechanism provides a decent feel during small movements and feels quite, for want of a less confusing word, direct. But the self-centering speed of the wheel is about as slow as anything I've ever driven. This meant I had to adapt my driving style slightly, and rather than just letting the car self-correct some slides, I had to physically apply the corrections myself. It's a small detail, but I think it's one that really separates this from more expensive offerings. This may be especially important to those that intend on taking part in driving styles that make heavy use of a car's natural tendency to self-center the steering, such as drifting or rallying. Moving a little closer to the floor now, and let's take a look at the pedals. The three pedals do each have a slightly different feel. The clutch and accelerator are both conventionally spring operated, but have different resistances, with the throttle being the lighter of the two. This is pretty much par for the course on most pedal sets, and while the resistance is much lower than on the more expensive counterparts, there's really not a lot of difference in terms of usability. Heavier pedals are nice and may offer more precision, but it's far from game-changing. Where there is a much bigger performance differentiation is in the brake pedal. High-end sets use load cells which measure the force being applied to the pedal, while entry-level units like the Logitech and Thrustmaster offerings measure the travel or the movement of the pedal. Most people agree that the use of a heavy load cell setup makes it easier to make small modulations of brake pressure. This means it's easier to find the braking limit and prevent lockups. That being said, the Logitech pedals have their own system for simulating the increased pressure near the limit of travel. In addition to a heavier spring on the middle pedal, there's also a rubber stopper that engages as the pedal nears its limit of travel. This increases the resistance at the critical part of brake travel, and it does make it just a little bit easier to modulate your foot pressure, though this is a very slight improvement at best. All in all, the pedal set does what it's supposed to do, and after a little bit of time spent adjusting to the two-stage brake pedal, I soon got the hang of things. And before we move on, I think it's worth pointing out there are all sorts of mods and upgrades available to change the feel and function of the Logitech pedals. Heavier springs to increase resistance, inserts to change the feel, and even add-on load cells to change the way the pedals work entirely. Just before Christmas, I made a video comparing some hot laps that I'd completed with both my direct drive and load cell brake-based system to those of the G29. The TLDR is that I was just as fast with either wheel and pedal setup once I'd adapted, though I did make the comment that I felt like I could probably be more consistent on the high-end gear thanks to the more detailed feedback and the superiority of load cell brakes. I also showed this chart as evidence that there are plenty of fast guys out there using entry-level equipment like the G29, G920 and their predecessors. My point then was that high-end gear doesn't make you quicker, but I think that it also illustrates that the G29 is a great entry-level wheel and pedal set. As I mentioned at the top of the video, at the price point, there's really nothing else that compares with the G29, so in one way it's pretty easy to recommend. But I think that just looking at it as some sort of value judgment misses some of the detail about what's great about this setup. The G29 and 920 are very well thought through evolutions of a long line of popular products from Logitech. They do everything they need to do to a sufficient standard, for most users at least, and do so without any glaring obvious drawbacks. Sure, there are compromises to keep it at a consumer-friendly price point, but it's all been done carefully and cleverly, by a company that has a long reputation for doing just that. So that just about brings things to a close here. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, it would be great if you could hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you can see more content like this in the future. So all that's left to say is goodbye, thank you for watching, and enjoy the rest of your day.